All right. Um, so, lecture on Judaism and Christianity, or at least ancient Judaism and the beginnings of Christianity. We will be talking about the Bible. Be talking about the books of Genesis, Exodus, Kings, Isaiah, and Daniel from the Old Testament. And then I'll be moving on to the Gospel of Matthew primarily in the New Testament by the end of the lecture. Um, this lecture is not meant to convert you in case you're not either of these religions. Um, it's merely meant as examination of some of the ideas within the text and within the religions themselves. And so, when we're talking about God in this lecture, um, and some if some of you are atheists and you're thinking to yourself, well, there is no God, so none of this makes any matters at all. The thing to recognize is that um, I'm trying to explain what they think about the world and human beings and actions and choices based on the worldview that they have, right? So, um, these different groups of people that do believe in God, this is how it impacts the way they think about themselves and about each other and about history and about how we fit into the world around us. And the reason why we need to talk about them is because, as much as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle have affected the way we think in today's world, in the U.S. and Europe and Latin America and Australia. That's what we mean by the West. The same thing is true for Judaism and Christianity. They have influenced the way we think in the West, and that includes Europe, America, Latin America, and Australia. And that even includes you. Even if you are an atheist, uh, the reality is that, as Nietzsche points out, and we'll talk about Nietzsche later in the year, or later in the semester rather, um, that even the atheist that is brought up in the Western world, their morality, their ethics is still pretty much a Judeo-Christian morality. Even though they don't believe in God, their definition of you know what is good or what is bad is still primarily the Ten Commandments, right? Um, those of you that are atheists, if I asked you what you thought about, the, what if I asked you what you thought about, having respect for your parents or lying in court to get people in trouble, if I asked you about, murder, if I asked you about stealing, most of you would say, you should honor your parents and you should not steal, you should not murder, and you should definitely not lie about people to get them in trouble and get them in jail. Well, guess what? That's part of the Ten Commandments. So, the point that I'm making is that, even if you don't believe in God and you don't believe in any of these religions, the reality is that many of your ideas and beliefs in your head have still been influenced by them. And it's probably a good idea for us to examine them so that we understand the history of how we came to think this way in the first place. The other thing I want to clarify is that when I use the word Christian in this class, I don't mean only born again Christians, right? Um, in this class, when we talk about Christianity or Christians, what we mean is any of the different religious groups that believe in Jesus Christ. So that would include, you know, uh, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Evangelical, Adventist, Calvinist, and so on and so forth. Right, the list keeps going on and on. So any and all of those are what I refer to as Christian here. I know there's huge differences between them, but the for the purposes of this class, which is just an intro class, right? Um, they they get their ideas and their religious ideas and moral ideas from the words and examples of Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth. And so keep that in mind, right? That's who I'm referring to. It's really all of them. So let's go ahead and jump into the lecture. Um, one of the things I want to point out about the Old Testament, and again, we're focusing here on Genesis and Exodus, Isaiah and Daniel and Kings. Um, one of the central themes that you see in all of these stories, and you have to remember, these stories were collected over hundreds of years, maybe even a couple thousand years. It wasn't one person writing all of it, right? In fact, many of the stories in Genesis predate not only Christianity, they predate Judaism. They go back to even before. They go back to Mesopotamia, which I've mentioned before. If you look carefully at Genesis, it tells us that um, Abraham, when he was still Abram, um, was, uh, if I'm not mistaken, from the city of Chaldea, right? Or his father, at least, was from the city of Chaldea. That's one of the city states in Mesopotamia. Um, and so the kind of biblical scholars kind of believe that a lot of the stories before Abraham's story in Genesis, like the 7 days of creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, etc., Noah's Ark, and so on, that a lot of those stories are kind of uh, modified, adapted stories Abraham brought with him from his culture in Mesopotamia. And he had kind of adapted those stories to this kind of new way of thinking that he was developing when he converted to becoming what we now call Judaism. Um, so that's why, like, when you read old myths from like the Sumerians or the Babylonians or the Akkadians, you see things that are very similar to what we see in Genesis, like a flood with survivors, right? In the myth, or the epic of Gilgamesh, right? Um, which we know as a Sumerian epic, but it's probably older than that. Um, Gilgamesh is king and builder of the city of Ur, which was one of the Mesopotamian cities. And there's a towards the end where he's looking for immortality, he looks for another character called Utnapishtim, which is the survivor of the flood, like Noah, right? And so, no, I'm just trying to kind of give you examples so you can see how there are similarities in stories between the people of Mesopotamia and what later becomes the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. Um, the other thing to keep in mind is that the Old Testament is a Jewish book. It was theirs. The first five books in particular are called the Pentateuch, right? Which are the books collected by the followers of Moses. Um, and that's Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, right? Um, and so, you got to keep in mind that these are Jewish books that then the Christians incorporated into what we now call the Bible. So let's get back to these early books in the Old Testament, right? Like Genesis, Exodus, and Isaiah in particular. Um, Central theme, right? These are different stories gathered together by different writers across different centuries, but that are still part of the same cultural tradition. So, what binds them together? What's the central theme we can identify across them all? And what we have there is what you see there on the first list, on the first item. Basically, the idea of God versus the God man, right? What do I mean by that? God, the creator, the infinite creator of the universe, versus the human being that wants to make himself God. That's what I mean. God's will versus human will. Right? And we see this even from the first story, with Adam and Eve. Um, God gives, like as a gift, the natural world to Adam and Eve. And all he asks is for obedience, right? Which is not a power trip. The obedience is for their own good because God knows better what's best for us. And what do humans do? They reject the natural and they object the commandments, right? Humans come up with their own ideas of good, um, and that involves rejecting the natural for the artificial, right? Eden, a natural garden provided by God, is exchanged for the city, right? Which is first built by Cain, the son of Adam and Eve. Um, and so you've got this idea of like what God wants for us versus what we want for ourselves, right? God's will versus human will. This idea that we want to be gods unto ourselves. We want to be in charge, right? That's a central theme throughout the Old Testament. And let me give you a few examples, and so that we can kind of see how this fleshes itself out. Um, and so, in the first bullet, you see that um, God makes. It says in Genesis that God makes human beings in their image, right? And what does that mean? Well, being in God's image means, the only thing we know about God at the time is that God is a speaker and a creator, right? In a few lines before this line, it says, God spoke, saying, "Let there be light." And there was light separated from darkness, the first day and the first night. Um, and God said that it was good, right? And so, this, the idea here is that God is a creator who creates through speech, right? It is by speaking that God makes things happen, right? By saying, "Let there be light," light appears. So there's this connection between speaking and creating in God. God, the maker of the world, the maker of the universe, the maker of Adam and Eve, right? And so when it says God makes human beings in their image, it doesn't mean that we have a head and two arms and two legs like God does, because God doesn't have those things. It means that we are made like God. And many people have thought that that means that we're rational like God. But if you look at human history, we're not rational, right? We don't go with the rational choice. We're animals that still kind of pick emotion, tribalism, right? As part of, think as far as we've come by 2023, we still create wars based off of things like skin tone and accent and religious beliefs and nationality. Those are all different forms of tribalism. What's the difference between that and, one group of primates fighting another group of primates for territory? We're still the same primates. So we're not rational. That idea that God made us rational like Him is a product of the Age of Enlightenment and the influence from the Greeks. If we look carefully at the text, when it says that human beings are made in God's image, it means that we are speaker and creator, right? And if you continue looking at the bullet, you see that when Adam first spends time with God after being created, God sets him to naming the animals of the earth, right? And God gets amused with the names that like Adam comes up with for the animals. But notice that in speaking their names, Adam comes to know them and thereby gets dominion over them, right? Speaking names creates reality. Um, and God tells Adam that he should have dominion over the animals, right? Um, so one of the points I'm making is that like very early on with Adam is a little bit of proof of what I'm talking about, right? Adam can speak and he creates names for the animals, and then he's given power over the animals. So there's this idea of power and creation and speech that are bound together both in the example of God and in the example of Adam. Now, why is this important? Because this gives us, right, it gives us a similarity to God, right, but without God's knowledge, right? God knows everything in the Bible, and therefore God knows what really is good. Humans only think they know what is good. And that's what brings us to the second part of the story of Adam and Eve, right? In the story, um, we have a choice. We can choose to remain in Eden, forever young, immortal, without work or labor or suffering or age or death. Or we can taste of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's a mouthful. And people always call it the tree of good and evil, but it's not. It's the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right? And what does this choice represent? Right? The choice between Eden and the fruit. Basically, it's a choice between what is given by God versus what is taken from God. Right? Something to keep in mind is that the name of the fruit is misleading. Right? It's called knowledge of good and evil, and it gives the impression that this means you attain the understanding of objective truth concerning the nature of good and evil. However, what we see in the story is that Adam and Eve have a sense of what good and evil is, but they don't really know what good and evil is. Right? The serpent explains to Eve when he tempts her to taste the fruit that tasting the fruit would endow her with the power of gods. But the serpent never tells Eve what exactly the power is, right? Um, so what is this power that that Eve wants from the fruit that is God's power when she's tempted to taste the fruit? For that we have to look at God again. When we look at God in that story of creation in the first 7 days, you notice that God proclaims, when gazing upon his works in the 7 days of creation, that they are good, with a sense of satisfaction or even appreciation for his own creation and product. In other words, at the end of each of the 7 days, God looks at what he accomplished what he accomplished there that day, and he always calls it good, right? Day and night was good. Land and water was good. The creatures of the sea were good. The creatures of the land were good. Um, and so it's like kind of God putting his arms on his hands on his waist, going, looking at the work at the end of the day and going, yes, this feels. I'm satisfied. I did a good day's work, right? So notice it's the first time we see the word good. And then all of a sudden we come back to the serpent and the fruit, and it has this idea of good again. Right? Eve and Adam, by tasting that fruit, are infected by that power. What exactly is the power again? The, the power to label things good. Not to know whether they're good, to label them as good. And to be convincing of oneself and others that what we label good is good. That's a power. Again, the power of speech. Can we use words to label things? And are we doing it accurately or not? Right? And as I mentioned here in the explanation, right, the problem of original sin then uh, is the problem of human self-delusion, right? We delude ourselves into thinking that what we do and what we say and what we choose is good because we become satisfied with ourselves. The problem is, right, that we mislead ourselves, we delude ourselves, because when God labels his creation good, it actually is true, because God is creating the universe, and he's not even creating it for himself, he's creating it for others, right? Adam and Eve, and by extension humanity, are often anything but good. The things we do and the things we say are often not good. They're evil. They're causes of suffering. They're causes of pain. And yet, we do them out of misguided standards of moral, political, and practical good. Right? In other words, we use the word good as if we know what it means, and we label things good, and then we go and we kill, and we murder, and we imprison, and we torment, and we enslave, and we exploit in the name of these goods. So, we have the power to label things as good or evil, but we don't actually have the understanding and the knowledge to label them as actually good. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes? We see more examples of this, right? So, I mean, think about it. Eve thinks having equal power to God is good. She thinks that it's more good than Eden, which is what God's giving them. Adam thinks that it's more good to keep Eve by his side, more good than keeping God by his side, right? The choices each of them make is based off of a misguided idea of what is good. And we're going to see that with their children, right? Cain murders his brother Abel because he thinks it's a good idea to remove the competition so that God has no choice but to pick him as the favorite, right? Again, a misguided idea of good. Cain invents agriculture. He's the first farmer. And he's also the first builder of the first city. And the thing is that both agriculture and city building have to do with exploitation, taking advantage of something else or someone else, and transformation, changing the wild into something domesticated according to human ideals, right? The farmer clears away the forest because he thinks it's better to plant crops. The builder of cities clears away the wild in order to build streets and towers and skyscrapers, right? Um, both, you know, are taking what is given and transforming it according to your own idea of what's good. The wild is no longer good for us. What God gave us as a planet isn't good enough. We have better ideas of what is good than what God is giving us. And so we reject it and then corrupt it and transform it and poison it, right? And we're seeing this very early on already with Adam, Eve, and Cain. Look at the next story, the Tower of Babel, right? In the Tower of Babel, you have a city with towers trying to reach for the heavens without God. Here we have again a utopian ideal as universalist empire building, right? Mouthful again. What does that mean? Basically, you have this idea of, in the story of the Tower of Babel, everybody speaks the same language, and they are all working, you know, according to what the leaders have decided, which is to reach for heaven without God by building towers that'll be tall enough to get there. What does God do? He strikes them down with multiple languages to create division amongst them. Why? Because they're wrong. What makes them wrong? The fact that they think they know what good is. Now, some of you may see, like, well, everybody's speaking one language, they're all working together. It sounds pretty utopian. What's the problem with it? The problem is this: once they finish the towers reaching the heaven, who actually gets to live up in the towers? All of them? Or the elite? But who actually built the towers? All of them? Or the elite? Right? So notice that, like, when it comes to building of cities, right, the elite are the ones that live in the penthouses up in the heavens, and the working class that actually built it are down in the slums, in the alleyways, in the tenement buildings, right? Living in pollution, getting taken advantage of. The city is a human idea of what is good. The wild is God's present to us, of something that was actually bountiful, something that was actually good, right? That's what Eden represents. The hunter, gatherer, forager part of our existence, right? A nostalgia for the simple time of being able to just pick our fruits and our nuts and our vegetables off of the wild's bounty. Um, Look at the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Those are struck down by fire from the sky by God. Um, Now, some people try to tell you that Sodom and Gomorrah had to do with homosexuality. If you look at the Bible carefully, that's not what it's about. It's about sexual violence. The cities are not struck down because they're gay. They're struck down because they're breaking the rules of hospitality that were very important back then. back then, if you look at, doesn't matter what stories you look at, Greek stories, Roman stories, Egyptian stories, Mesopotamian stories, Jewish stories, if you broke the rules of hospitality and did violence to your guests, the gods would visit you down with punishments from the heavens. Zeus did it, Odin did it, and here we see Yahweh doing it. In Sodom and Gomorrah, they were raping foreign visitors to their cities because they were paranoid that they were spies for foreign armies. Um, they're breaking the rule of hospitality. That's why they got burned to the ground. It had nothing to do with, LGBTQ. Um, but people interpret it a certain way to get you to hate and fear people who are different from you, which is power for them. Right? In the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah burned to the ground. Right? Again, what is good? Uh, Certain elites, certain leaders convince the rest of the group that it's good to go around kidnapping foreigners and doing violence to them. Right? Exodus, story of the pharaohs in Egypt who enslave, the Hebrews and other people from around the areas, including Ethiopia and other areas, for the purposes of building pyramids as a way of reaching immortality for the pharaoh kings only. Right? What does God do? He sends 10 plagues. The Hebrews themselves, when they've been freed from slavery, they ungrateful and stubborn. As soon as God turns around with Moses, they build a statue of a golden calf and start worshiping it at Mount Sinai, while God is literally giving the 10 Commandments to Moses. What does God do? He punishes them with 40 years in the desert until every single adult that was participating in that ends up dying of old age in the desert, never reaching the promised land. Um, I won't go into all of these, examples in detail, but here's the point. What do they all have in common? The one thing they all have in common is that you have human beings rejecting the commands of God, rejecting the gifts of God for something they consider to be better, right? They have their own definitions of good and evil, humans. And these misguided definitions of good and evil lead to cities burning down, slavery, exploitation, war, and genocide, right? All for what? For more resources to build cities with. Cities that are filled with exploitation not only of the working class, but exploitation of nature and resources as well. The city is a parasite, right? It doesn't grow anything on its own. It takes what other people grow somewhere else. Right? And this is one of the reasons why rural communities resent urban communities, right? Because they take, and what they give them back is what? Wi-Fi, channels on cable TV, video games like Grand Theft Auto, right? This is, drugs. Um, and so you have to remember, like, these stories in the Old Testament are written primarily by people in rural areas that are kind of fighting against urban areas, right? This is not something that's new that only happens in American politics, right? It's something that's already been happening for at least 3 or 4 thousand years. There's a difference of perspective, right? What some people consider the perspective of God versus what other, the perspective of human beings. Now, we see that even once they get to the promised land, right, God sends prophets to lead the Jewish people in Judea, and the Jewish people want kings instead. Right? The term Messiah literally in Hebrew means anointed one, but it was the title they created for their kings. Their first Messiah was Saul, not to be confused with the one that becomes Paul. This is another Saul, right? The first Messiah is Saul, the second one is David, the third one is Solomon, and then it continues all the way down until we get to Herod at the beginning of the New Testament. Right? What's the problem with kings? God didn't want to give them a king because kings become corrupt. He wanted to give them prophets because prophets live humbly, kind of like Plato's philosopher kings, right? All they want to do is get to know God better. They don't want to be in charge. They don't want a throne. They don't want a palace. They don't want huge parties. They don't want to tax the people, right? Um, but notice, as I'm pointing out in the first bullet here, the Hebrews in Judea want a king because the king represents to them a military, faith in human power and violence. And they reject prophets. In fact, they even killed a couple of the prophets because that's different. That's not faith in human violence. That's a faith in an invisible God, right? The Hebrews, just like most human beings, have an easier time believing in physical human violence that they can see, instead of having faith in an invisible God they cannot see. And that's what that when you look at Kings, Isaiah, Daniel, etc., right? That's the choice, right? The choice is, do we want rulers and elites and laws and militaries and weapons and violence as a form of establishing security and stability, or do we have enough faith to be able to live without those things, to be able to just trust each other, right? It's kind of this idea of almost anarchism. But I don't mean here anarchism as in like the A with the circle and the black t-shirts and the spray painting and the graffiti and all that. No. Here we mean in the sense of, if people had enough faith in God and followed the messages of God and the prophets of God, we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need kings, we wouldn't need governments, we wouldn't need prisons, we wouldn't need law enforcement, right? People would just kind of be able to cooperate with each other. At least that's the suggestion coming from some of these books in the Old Testament. Unfortunately, they pick kings, right? And so what happens? Well, as the next bullet points out, there ends up being corruption, creating a systemic dystopian exploitation, right? Because of their faith in violence and kings, the Hebrews not only got enslaved to the kings of Egypt, eventually they get enslaved to the Babylonians, they get enslaved to the Assyrians, and then eventually they become occupied by the Roman Empire. Worse than that, they become enslaved to a system of sacrifice that ends up being really just a money racket. And what I mean by that is, after the time of Moses, Joshua winds up creating kind of this list of animal sacrifices that have to be done in order to remove sin from your hands. And it becomes so widespread in Jewish culture that no one's willing to do business with you if you can't afford to go do these sacrifices, because they believe that sin transfers from people to people. Like even just doing business. If you're doing business with a sinner, the sinner's sins become your sins as well, because you're endorsing them by doing business with them. And so, if you look at the subheading of bullets there, right? Not only do you have the Roman Empire collecting taxes, but then you have Herod, right, which is the Jewish Messiah or the Jewish king, collecting his own taxes, right? They're paying taxes twice, kind of like in California, state tax and then the federal tax. The difference is, at least when the Roman Empire collected taxes, they built roads that are still there now, 2,000 years later. They built running water through aqueducts and irrigation systems. They were able to improve shipping and international trade. And they were able to establish stability politically and criminally because they had the best military and no one was attacking the Hebrews anymore, right? So that's where the Roman taxes went. When Herod collected taxes, he just kept making bigger palaces for himself, and he continued, you know, and he continued throwing huge parties for rich people and orgies and whatnot through taxpayer money, right? So there's kind of this idea. Besides Herod collecting a second tax, you had the Sadducees, which were the high priests. All right, they accepted money for animals to be sacrificed, and then they collected money again for the actual sacrificing. Right, so they would raise the animals, sell them to you, and then kill them for you. And you had to pay them twice. Then you had scribes who would read these books for you to figure out which animals you needed and how you needed to sacrifice them, and they charged money for it. And then you had the Pharisees, who were the community elders and the experts of the law, who would collect money as well in order to tell you what part you needed read because the scribes were going to charge you by the page, right? So you have everybody collecting money for these sacrifices and for these taxes. Who's getting screwed? The poor, the working class. And the problem is they can't afford all these sacrifices. When they couldn't afford it, this forced them into poverty because, as I mentioned before, no one would want to do business with them anymore since they weren't purified anymore, right? And this sets up Jesus. This is where Jesus comes into the picture in the New Testament. Jesus, in the gifts of the Magi, right, the three wise kings, they bring frankincense, myrrh, and gold. Frankincense is an incense burned by the priest class. Myrrh is a root used by the doctors, the healers, and gold was something only kings had. And so basically what the gifts represent is they represent this unification between king and prophet, right? Jesus no longer wants the separation between the king and the prophet amongst the Jewish people. He wants to unite the Messiah represents not only the Vates, the prophet, but also the king coming together, right? And how does Jesus want us to do that? By modeling what a good man and a good life look like, right? In other words, if we all followed the example of Jesus, literally followed the example of Jesus, and I'm going to go over that right now, we would no longer need kings, and we would no longer need prophets, and we would no longer need laws or taxes or prisons or executions or wars or militaries. That's the point of Jesus, right? He's a model of what a human, what a good person actually looks like. What is, remember Aristotle and the Greeks were asking, what exactly is the good life? What is a good man, right? And so the idea is in the New Testament that Jesus literally models it for us. When Jesus says, look at the quote, right? Thomas, one of the apostles, who's known as Doubting Thomas, right, says, how can we know the way? How do we know the way to being good? Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would know my Father as well. Later in Matthew, or rather earlier in Matthew, Jesus also says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. When most, Christians talk about Jesus' quote about "I am the way, the truth, and the life," most of them try to argue that you have to be Christian in order to get to heaven, right? And so Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and everybody else is going to burn in hell because they don't believe in Jesus, etc. Jesus isn't talking about that. Notice, he's telling Thomas. Thomas is asking, how do we know the way to being good, the way to heaven? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right? In other words, no one comes to Father except through me. In other words, unless you follow my example, you can't make it. Right? Now, at this point, somebody could say, well, that's your interpretation versus the preacher's interpretation. Okay, but let's find more examples, right? More proof. This class is about proof and evidence. Notice in the next bullet, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? You don't love your neighbor because your neighbor is worthy of love. They're no more worthy of love than you or I are. You love your neighbor because you love your God. The point Jesus is making, notice, he puts the two commandments together. What is love? Any child can tell you that love is action. No child will believe a parent when the parent tells them that they love them and then they don't feed them and they don't hug them and they don't take care of them when they're sick. Right? Love is action. To love someone is to take care of them and to care for them. So notice when Jesus says love your God, how can you care for God if God is omnipotent? If God is all powerful? God doesn't need you. God doesn't need me. So how can we love God if there's nothing we can do for God? If there's no action by which we love God? Now some of you are going to say, oh, well, we can go to church and we can sing and we can pray. God doesn't need any of that. That's not caring for God. Jesus gives you the second commandment for a reason. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Why? Because that's how you love God. By loving each other, you love God. By caring for each other, you care for God. That's why Jesus puts the two together in one quote. Right? In other words, the only way we can show God that we love God is by taking care of our neighbor. More proof for that. Look at what it says in the subset of bullets. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And the measure you use, it will be measured to you. People, those of you who know you're our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So, what does it mean to love your neighbor? To forgive, to not judge. One of the apostles asked Jesus, how many times should we forgive? Some of the people we know keep doing the same mistakes. Jesus says, forgive 7 times, 77 times. Right? What's the point? Loving your neighbor means forgiving. And honestly forgive, not just saying the words. That's step 1. Step 2, Matthew 10:8. Jesus tells the apostles, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, drive out the demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Right? In other words, you heal the sick for free. You raise the dead for free. You clean the lepers, the dirty, for free. You drive out the demons, heal the mentally ill for free. Right? So, notice the next bullet. Jesus feeds the hungry for free. So, one of the points is, right, that to love God means to take care of each other, to feed people when they're hungry, to give them drink when they're thirsty, to clothe them when they're naked, to house them when they're homeless, to heal them when they're sick, to educate them when they're ignorant. That's what Jesus is asking. That's what it means to take care of someone. What your parents would do for you is what you should do for others if you love God. Because that's the only way to, right? Love is action. And the only action you can do on behalf of God is for other people. Now, some of you may be, well, I got to work for a living. I got to make money. Look at what Jesus says next. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. No one can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve both God and money. So either you serve wealth or you serve God. But you can't do both. And this is why, like, Jesus would reject prosperity gospels, right? Like Joel Osteen. Because prosperity gospel, like Joel Osteen, wants people to think it's okay to be rich, and you can still be a good person, right? But the question Jesus wants people to ask is, how do you get rich, right? Are you telling me that you get rich by taking care of people, or by taking advantage of them, right? Are you paying them $7.50 an hour and expecting them to be able to feed their children, or take their children to the hospital and be able to pay those bills? Can they go to the doctors without health insurance, which you refuse to give them as part of their benefits? For what? So that you can have a second house on the lake with a jet ski? Don't go to church coughing up all this money, to put more statues in your church, when your workers can't even take their children to a doctor. And doctors, why are you charging so much money? Because you know people get sick and die without your help. People will pay anything to stay alive. So don't tell me that you're healing people because you care for them, when then you're going to charge them insane amounts of money that they need insurance to help them pay for, right? This is what Jesus is getting at, right? As a general rule, most people who get wealthy by taking advantage of others. Look at the next quote. He tells the rich boy, "Go, sell your possessions, and give to the poor. You will have treasure in heaven. Then, here's the key, come and follow me." Again, what does it mean to follow him? Literally, walk in his footsteps, follow his shoes. Then the young man went away sad, because he had great wealth, right? Notice the young man can't give up everything. He can't give up his money and his nice horses and his nice camels and his servants, right? And so Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Truly I tell you, it is hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven." Right? This is the reference to the camel getting through the eye of the needle. Now, he's not saying it's impossible, right? The eye of the needle is a gate in the walls of the city. And merchants who overpacked their camels would often have to unpack all the merchandise off the camel, lead the camel through the gateway, which is called the eye of the needle, and then bring the merchandise through the gate and then put it back on the camel to get them to the marketplace. What Jesus is saying is, it's easier to unpack all that stuff off a camel than for people who have a lot of possessions to get rid of those possessions, because they cling to us. They put their hooks in us. We become addicted to these things, right? What's the point? The point is, we cannot be materialistic. We cannot be greedy for wealth and be good and be followers of Christ. We also can't be violent. Notice in the next quote, "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to his follower. "All who draw the sword will die by the sword." Greater love no one has than this, to lay down his life for his friends. But who are your friends? For Jesus, your friends are your neighbor. Literally, whoever's in front of you, including your enemy. What's the point? The point is that Texas obsession with AR-15s and automatic weapons and shotguns and guns is not exactly Christian. When Jesus is telling the guy to put the sword back, that guy drew out the sword to try to defend Jesus. Jesus is telling us, not even in self-defense. A person who is no longer living in fear, a person who is living in love because they have conquered fear. Faith, again, this connects back to the Old Testament. Faith in human violence. And violence isn't just weapons, it's economics, right? You can use money and power. You can use jobs to hurt people. Faith in violence, in human violence, or faith in an invisible God of love? Where is your faith? Which one do you really believe in when it comes to living your life? What you live is what you really believe. And if you're believing in the faith in money and power and weapons and violence, then the faith you espouse is hollow, empty noises, right? Is this a hard road to walk? It is. That's why at the beginning Jesus said, it's narrow, the gate. Right? So what am I getting at? Jesus is trying to continue the conversation from the Old Testament. Do we have faith in an invisible God of love, or do we have faith in visible human violence? Which is the road that we're taking? But what Jesus is pointing out, we wouldn't need the violence if we all just walked in the other form of faith, right? If we stop being afraid, love is meant not just to conquer death and sin, but to conquer fear, right? Eve was afraid of having to live under God's power. Adam was afraid of not living with Eve. Cain was afraid of not being loved by God. Cain was afraid of living in the wild by himself instead of with a bunch of people in the city. The people of the Tower of Babel are afraid of not being able to reach heaven on their own. The pharaohs are afraid of being forgotten. The rich are afraid of being poor. The violent are afraid of being weak and having violence done to them. Right? Judeo Christianity, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Jewish and the Christians, the, 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 the faith that they're talking about is the faith that leads to a love that conquers fear. Right? Fear is the ultimate enemy. As you can see, I haven't been talking about Jesus as God, but rather as philosopher, because this is not a theology class, it's a philosophy and ethics class. So I hope that this was interesting to you. The ideas here are the ideas about a philosophy of Judaism and Christianity, not so much about like the whole question of, Jesus is God or not. That's a whole other question. This is more just about like what exactly is the ethics? What is the morality we're supposed to live by according to these books? I hope you enjoyed it. Um, this kind of concludes the last lecture for antiquity. At this point, you should be collecting your notes and studying to get ready for the exam on the ancient world. The next lecture will take place in the next module where we jump forward to the beginning of the Middle Ages. I'll see you then.